All right, we are right at 5:15, so I think we're gonna go ahead and get started. Hi everyone, I'm Dr. E. Feinberg. I'm president of the Chicago Coalition for Family Building. I'm a practicing reproductive endocrinologist and infertility specialist and the medical director at Northwestern Fertility and Reproductive Medicine. I am joined by an esteemed panel. I'm here today with Vice President of our Coalition Board, Dr. Jennifer Hirshfeld-Cytron, also a reproductive endocrinologist and infertility specialist with Fertility Centers of Illinois. Nidhi Desai of Desai and Miller, a family building law firm. Nidhi is also a coalition board member and ART director of the American Academy of Assisted Reproductive Technology Law Attorneys and a coalition friend. And Dr. Amanda Adeleye, who's the CCRM medical director. Dr. Adeleye joins us following Thursday's State of the Union address, where she served as a guest of Senator Tammy Duckworth. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping items. At any time, please feel free to submit questions to our Q&A chat functionality, and we'll do our best to address them within the 45 minutes of this webinar. This is being recorded. It will be posted to our YouTube channel and to social media. Feel free to share the content far and wide. As a physician, it is an understatement to share our concern and our alarm in the recent Alabama state IVF ruling. Also, as an attorney, I would imagine the same for you, Nidhi. Providing access to medical care for those seeking to build families is something that we all focus on professionally and also personally through our nonprofit work at the Chicago Coalition for Family Building. Through the distribution of many grants over the years, our team is passionate in our dedication to improving access to fertility treatment. We also aim to provide education about fertility issues, and this is one of many in our webinar series. As such, we wanted to sit down today to discuss the state of affairs. So let's begin. Since I brought up the State of the Union, Dr. Adeleye, Amanda, can you tell us a little bit about how that came about and what it was like to be there?
Yeah, I feel like it was one of the best times in my life, and I've always been pretty politically oriented since adolescence. And when the Alabama Supreme Court ruling, the LePage ruling, came out, I was particularly disturbed, although, of course, I've been upset since Dobbs. And at any rate, I just emailed our senator. If our participants live in Illinois, I emailed Senator Duckworth and just expressed my appreciation for her Access to Family Building Act, and that I'm an RE and I'm available for any kind of help. And her team reached out. And going to the State of the Union was incredible. I don't want to take up too much time, but I would say my biggest takeaway that I think is relevant for this group is that there are lots of people that care. As scary as this time is, there are so many people working to change course here and to make sure what happened in Alabama does not happen at a federal level. But I do think it also is important to stay aware. So those would be my big takeaways from the State of the Union.
Amazing. Did you find that people shared their stories? I mean, I know a number of congressmen and women that have been through fertility treatment. Did you feel that they were pretty open about their own experiences? Did you have a chance to speak with any of them?
It's interesting. I think there was chatter about various Congress people and their experiences with IVF that did not come out. But I do think many Congress people brought guests who shared their stories, including Leader Schumer, who brought a woman who had used IVF for PGTM, is what it sounds like. So there are a number of guests that I think had personal experiences with fertility care. But I think outside of Senator Duckworth, who's very open about her fertility journey, I don't know that I heard as many Congress people.
Interesting. So backing up a little bit, Nidhi, we're going to tap into some of your legal advice. I always tell my patients that Illinois is a really safe state to practice reproductive medicine in, not only because we have a wonderful state mandate, but we also have some laws in Illinois that help to protect patients who are undergoing infertility. Can you speak a little bit? I think let's start with the recent Alabama ruling. If you could lay the groundwork on what that was, and then also talk about what protections we have in Illinois. I think that would be fantastic.
Sure, I'd be happy to, sort of. So, the way that the Alabama case came about was that there were three sets of plaintiffs, three sets of people who sued, and their embryos were stored in a cryo tank in a hospital. And a patient that's not a fertility patient literally wandered in to the lab, opened the cryo tank, took the embryos out, didn't realize how cold they were, and he promptly dropped them. And when he dropped them, of course, the embryos were no longer viable. And so those were the facts of the case that gave rise to this Supreme Court decision. The lower court dismissed all the claims related to wrongful death because the embryos were embryos. And then once the case was elevated to the Supreme Court had to answer the question, are embryos considered people for purposes of the Alabama Wrongful Death Act? And based on, and I won't go into too much detail because the opinion was over 100 pages, but the premise of it was based on two things. The first one was an act from the 1800s, 1872, I believe. And that act, of course, predated IVF by more than 100 years, but they used that in conjunction with a constitutional amendment that was passed in the 2000s that both things put together equated an embryo with a human being. And I think there are many of us in the legal community who had multiple reasons why that's not true. In fact, Quad A, along with Resolve, and then ASRM separately, all filed amicus briefs after the opinion came out because they're looking to rehear the case. It's highly unlikely that will happen, but based on that reasoning, the court found that wrongful death suit can move forward. And so at this point, one of two things will happen. One is the motion to grant rehearing will be accepted, and then the Supreme Court will kind of stay this opinion that they come up with, but more likely than not, it'll then be remanded back down to the lower court, and the lower court is going to take a look at this issue. And I think it's important to note in the opinion, just you just get 2 pages into it and you're reading things like, the central question involves the death of embryos kept in a cryogenic nursery. And the question is whether there is an unwritten exception for extrauterine children, that is, unborn children located outside of a biological uterus at the time they are killed. So needless to say, it didn't take very long to get into the opinion to know which direction this court was going in. So that I'm happy to answer more questions about the opinion. We could talk about it for days, but I will turn to the happier question, which is what protections we have in Illinois. In 2018, conversations began about how to begin to protect women in the state who are undergoing reproductive care, because the writing was on the wall at that point. And this was very foresighted because it took another 4 years for Roe versus Wade to be overturned. But one of the things that came out of that was the Reproductive Health Act. And the Reproductive Health Act in Illinois guarantees the autonomy of the patient to make healthcare decisions along with her healthcare providers and protections for the healthcare providers to ensure that they are not going to be penalized for any decision they make in conjunction with their patient, of course, in the absence of negligence and all the other things that physicians are subject to.
Which I think is incredibly reassuring. Jenny, since this ruling came in, I know I've gotten a number of questions from patients. I would imagine you probably have too. Can you speak a little bit to those questions and then some of the conversations that you've had?
I think there's definitely been a high level of concern for many patients, really spanning a variety of people that we see. And we've had some patients who are doing egg freezing who become concerned, and just appreciating the subtlety that really even in Alabama, it's not egg freezing that's at risk here, and differentiating an unfertilized egg from a fertilized egg, even in some of these more restrictive theoretical constructs. It's patients who have frozen embryos with us. It's patients who are considering freezing embryos. It's a couple of my patients, I mean, we're very close to Indiana, who have recently moved and now a bit cautious about ever relocating their embryos, which I actually would agree with. We've had in our call center quite a few patients in Alabama who've been trying to seek a physician who would accept embryos outside the state, which is problematic for many, many reasons until that sort of some of those laws are, or I should say some of the court ruling is delineated. But I would say, as we know, there are large tissue repository centers who have offered their services to those patients who opt to try to move their embryos out of Alabama, things such as Reproductive, et cetera. And so I think it's important for patients to know that as well, that there are these large entities. Your embryos do not have to be held within a fertility clinic where you obtained your care. So I think it's that knowledge, and it's trying to provide reassurance for patients that see us. Some of the work that, Nidhi initiated even in 2005 that created our state to be so favorable toward gestational carrier and IVF in general. And it really highlights, I mean, it's an election year, so I can't help myself. Like, it really highlights how important it is how we all vote, because these laws come to be because we have state and local representatives who see this as a value. And I think the world has shown us you can never take that for granted.
Yeah. And I think that was, oh, go ahead.
Actually, that's the big message, that we are protected here, and it's a luxury, but it's a luxury we should never take for granted. And it's really important that we vote people who represent our interests and that we all get involved.
Yeah. And I think that was one of the things that, that Roe really took away, is Roe had this viability clause, and Nidhi, feel free to jump in if my legal language is not correct. Basically, one of the things that Roe had said was that that a child becomes a child or a citizen of the state once viability has been achieved, and it was defined around 24 weeks, the point at which a fetus could live separate from its mother's or gestational carrier's body, when that fetus was capable of living independently. And then when Roe was overturned, basically said, like, that decision now goes to each state independently. And I think that, as I see it, the idea of personhood, or saying that an embryo is a person, I think there are two things at play. One is sort of that religious belief of when does life begin? And I think you can have a religious belief that says that life begins at fertilization, but I think that that can also be separated from legislation saying that that embryo is a citizen. And so I think, what overturning Roe did was it left it to each state to really enact, like, when does life begin, and when does that entity become a citizen of the state? And they don't necessarily have to be the same answer. You can believe religiously that life begins at fertilization, but legally you can also believe that something becomes a citizen or gets protected at a different point throughout growth and development of an embryo.
But I think, that gets to a larger picture about, one of the values of our country was this idea of separation of church and state. And so what someone believes personally and religiously really has no place in the law. I think that's what's so scary to so many of us, because I didn't read all 100 pages. Like, I'm sure Nidhi has memorized, but I read enough that they had quoted the Bible as one of their references, and that's really alarming. That's one of the founding principles of our country.
I think someone counted, and it was like 45 references to God in a legal ruling. And I guess I don't have as much, obviously, I don't have any formal legal education, but to me, and Nidhi, I'm curious what you say about this, like, with regard to separation of church and state, like, how common is it in a state Supreme Court to have references to God?
So To answer that question, it's very uncommon to be referencing God in relation to legal decisions. I think you've all had patients who have struggled with the question of how many embryos should I create? And I've had clients who have said, we've just decided to make a few at a time, and they've incurred the risks that go along with that, the cost differences, the risk that then when they thaw the egg and go to inseminate it, it might not fertilize. It is not as simple as just doing it that way, but it's a personal choice. And that's the real point. Like each patient should be making that decision with their healthcare provider. One thing that was really striking about the decision is, I think back to the Davis versus Davis decision, which was in 1992, and it was a decision about an embryo dispute. And after the lower court had essentially found personhood for the embryos, the Supreme Court really went back and looked at all the scientific testimony and based their decision based on that scientific testimony, the idea. And at that point, there weren't even blastocysts that were being transferred. They were 3-day embryos. And understanding that the science didn't support this religious conviction that the embryo was a person, the Davis court found that they were embryos and they deserve special respect, but they certainly were not a person who was, from a legal standpoint, deserving of the protections that you and I or our, infant babies might have. And we've come so far during this time where not only have we rolled back some of these protections and now the states are in charge of them, but we're finding religious arguments. Now, I will say in this particular decision, the very hardcore religious talk was in a concurrence, which is not the main finding, but I think that that's also very striking. It was a very long concurrence. And that, I think, going back to something that Dr. Hirschfeld said, one of the points too is there's federal law and state law, and right now we don't have federal law on the books, but we are hearing, depending on what happens during this election, there could be federal law, and it could be federal law that codifies the idea of personhood. It could be federal law that, like Senator Duckworth has introduced, that will protect the rights of patients to make these decisions with their healthcare providers. But when we are coming up with these solutions and saying we believe in IVF, but we also believe that the embryo is a person, those are two logically inconsistent positions to take. You can't take both positions and then come up with a logical conclusion in each scenario. And that's really scary because you can see where that leads, and I think that's just a place that's just not appropriate for our patients.
Can I add 2 thoughts to that? One, I was really struck, Nidhi, by your discussion of Davis versus Davis. I'm not a lawyer, and so I don't have any sort of significant knowledge of case law, but you do, right? And we have other lawyers who do. And I think, to me, it strikes home, education is so important, right? The arguments you're making are not new, right? We can be all fired up about how personhood is not something that really makes sense from a legal standpoint, as physicians at least, but we're not the first ones saying this, right? This goes back 20 years. And so hearing you say that, I'm generally aware, but to have that concrete discussion about it is, I think, so important. And what's so unfortunate is kind of this lost history. And I think it's just accelerating as we go through time. People just are not passing on this information that it's totally inappropriate. And I think the other thing that you said that just really, without being alarmist, concerns me is there's state versus federal law, which is exactly what you said. And, I was paying close attention on the day after the Alabama ruling happened, and when Nikki Haley was still running, she initially had said that she thought that, yes, that embryos should have rights. I'm paraphrasing here. And then later in the day backtracked. But what that told me is that, somebody who's running for president can be, either kind of convinced for political reasons to, say something that they don't believe, or maybe they genuinely believe it. And we're that at risk as a country of having people intervene at a federal level, which would supersede what happens in Illinois and Illinois state law. But anyway, ultimately, I'm just echoing what you said, and I think you said it so concisely and thoroughly.
And I think let's talk a little bit about embryo disposition. So Dr. Adeleye, Amanda, I'm gonna pick on you a little bit. So when you're speaking with a couple and we're talking about IVF, we generally will talk about embryo disposition options. What do we tell patients, and how do we think about this scientifically? Because I think that as physicians, we really want to stick to the science behind what is an embryo and what does that represent?
Fortunately, by the time my patients get to the point of talking about the consent process for IVF and FET, I've already kind of hammered into them, the process of conception and things like that. So they're kind of two conversations happening at different points in time. But, in terms of embryo disposition, typically what I would tell folks is that there's a few different options, right? One is that you could freeze your embryos and maintain them as frozen until you're done building your family. And then when you're done, you could have them discarded, or you could donate them to, an embryo adoption group. And there's going to be some subtleties around there, or donate them to a family member or friend of your choosing. Or lastly, you could donate to science, but that's going to really depend on a lot of things at the time that you would make that decision. And I generally keep it concise. I do talk about, there can be some issues depending on if, if it's a couple that's generating embryos, has a disagreement in the future about what they'd like to do with those embryos, and talk through that. But that they're really, those are kind of the three broad categories for embryo disposition. And in terms of the biology of it, I haven't had to too frequently kind of distinguish between fertilization and conception, although nowadays I think that is more important. But, a fertilized egg can't be resuscitated, right? It grows in culture, and it grows or it stops. And then that's really it.
And so I want to touch a little bit about the idea of embryo donation, right? So there's two schools of thought on this. There are, again, sort of the scientific medicalized process of donating an embryo from one couple to another couple. And in order to do that, we typically have couples meet with psychology. We have the families be introduced, sometimes, not always. And then, medically speaking, it's quite simple to take a frozen embryo and do a frozen embryo transfer. It doesn't cost a lot of money, although there are some very real costs involved. However, there is also a more religious way of doing, or a more social services way of doing embryo donation, which is considered to be embryo adoption, and sort of ascribing this process that we use for children into the medical process of embryo donation. And Nidhi, I'm going to ask you to really speak about this legally, and what is embryo adoption, and why is it not simply a medical process of donation, and what's behind that legally and socially?
I would say from a legal standpoint, it is always embryo donation. And it's something that we've tried. I think adoption is a very colloquial term, like we say it, we adopt pets, we adopt, it's just the idea of taking on a responsibility for something is sometimes called adoption. But from a legal standpoint, it has very, very specific ramifications. So in every state, there are different laws for adoption of born children. And some of them require a waiting period before a birth parent can actually consent. Other states have 30-day revocation periods after someone consents. The idea behind embryo donation is we enter into agreements with the parties, and then once those agreements are made and the contract is signed, it is irrevocable. We don't want the idea, adoption is a separate legal process that shouldn't be confused with the donation process. And I think, now more than ever, it's really important to not conflate the two and to be really clear about our terminology, because sometimes terminology just creates reality almost. And, especially in this time when we're worried about personhood and we're worried about the way that things are being described and perceived, it's very important that we're always using the term embryo donation. Now, some facilities, as you mentioned, take a different approach. They will require a home study for a family. They will require certain steps be taken. But generally in an embryo donation, what happens, and this can happen whether you know the person or not, is that agreements are made between the parties, and those agreements will actually consider things like, do we stay in touch afterwards? What kind of information are you going to give us medically? How do we get in touch with you if my child has a genetic issue that might need your guidance or medical history or subsequent medical history after the donation happens? And so there's a whole host of issues that are discussed, and then the embryo donation agreement is signed. In Illinois, in 2015, we updated our parentage laws to protect children born of any sort of gamete donation, which would extend to embryo donation, to say that once those things happen and the intended parent gives birth, then that child is the sole legal child of the intended parents, and there are no possible other parents out there.
Yeah, and I guess, part of what scares me, and Jenny, feel free to jump in on this, but part of what scares me on this is, like, could states begin to prevent embryo destruction, either for research or for, for families that are done building their families? Like, how would you counsel a patient on that? What do you do in those situations?
I think I definitely want those embryos out of a state that is considering an embryo to be a person, before any action is taken. But that actually kept me up at night on Sunday, because on some of the Sunday morning shows, there were legislators out there that are saying, yeah, we can reconcile IVF with personhood, because those embryos can just be quote unquote adopted by someone else. Like, the idea that as a patient, you don't have control over what happens to your embryos is really terrifying. And again, it goes back to that church and state issue that we were talking about before, imposing one person's religious beliefs on an entire state's worth of people, and denying them the right to make decisions about their reproductive material is really terrifying.
Yeah,
I,
and
I agree. And there's also that law in the books in Louisiana, which, embarrassingly, I only recently found out about, but it's been on the books for many, many years. I think 1986 or something, that in Louisiana, embryos generated can't be thawed and discarded. And so routinely what providers do is, counsel patients to ship those embryos elsewhere, where they can maybe potentially enact whatever their ultimate goal is for that embryo.
Yeah, and I think very few, and I'm curious on both of your perspectives on this, but I have very few couples who willingly and enthusiastically donate their embryos to other couples. Like, I think it's a really complicated decision that it's not that simple that we can just have couples trade embryos.
Well, I mean, because it's taking away someone's autonomy, and that's Nidhi's whole point. If they're just awarded to the state, I mean, it's extremely problematic. It's problematic that these decisions that should be between a provider and a patient are going to be decided by by individuals who probably didn't pass high school biology. I mean, they don't have the capacity to differentiate between all the variety, all of the components that occur post-fertilization. It doesn't go from fertilization to child. We all know that because we do IVF every single day. We see how embryos development, or to Amanda's point, don't, and then they've degraded. And so it's so alarming, I think, in so many ways, which it really gets back to the point that Each and every one of us has an ability to change who represents us. And I think this is a call to arms for people in states like Alabama. You cannot just expect things to go in your favor. You have to take active control. And
Yeah.
I asked to Nidhi, like, the concern for a lot of people is, I mean, we've seen how politicians want to get into the business of medicine when it comes to reproduction, but the concern becomes, when does it stop? I mean, because they're now in the patient room with us, we're making decisions with their thoughts in our mind. I just think that's the other issue here that might get more people more involved in this issue, is that it's really challenging to have politicians involved in medical decision making, whether it's an embryo or something else. And I just think this could set a really bad precedent. I don't know if people have asked you about larger pictures of medical decision making and in this political climate, how it extends beyond reproductive rights.
Certainly the question has come up. First of all, what's the logical extension of this idea of personhood, which we know like the next step for that is contraception, forms of contraception that rely on stopping an embryo from implanting. That's the next step in reproductive medicine. And in other areas of medicine, I've certainly had people ask that question, but I think nowhere is it as apparent as it is in reproductive rights, as it is in women's health issues. We don't see this happening, in other areas that don't affect women and reproduction to the same extent. And I just want to spend one moment lest we think that this is sort of coming as opposed to here. I just want to go through some of the different definitions of embryos even right now. So in Tennessee, Missouri, and Arkansas, we've got the idea that from the moment of conception, an embryo is an unborn child. And then in some states like Louisiana, Texas, Kentucky, the moment of fertilization. So in Georgia, it's any stage of development in the womb. So we've got different definitions here, all kind of leading in the same direction. And I think without really, maybe contemplating some of the after effects, certainly at the time that they were passed, but it does go to this idea of who's representing you, what. And I've seen even this week, some efforts in some of the more conservative states to come up with legislation to be protective. And I don't know what hope they have of being passed right now. Well, I kind of do, but people are still trying, to the point that was made earlier on, that there are a lot of good people out there that are trying to do the right thing and reverse course here, but it's going to take everybody. It's going to take participation from everyone to make this happen. It's not going to happen by itself.
I'll
Yeah,
say,
go
go ahead.
ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
So I was just going to say, I think that the legislation and the potential for legislation can extend beyond IVF, right? Like, I think about the woman who has a miscarriage. Like, can she all of a sudden be charged with murder of her, of her child for having a miscarriage? Or somebody who is in a car accident, the at-fault driver, can they be charged with wrongful death of a minor if the woman driving a car goes on to have a miscarriage? I see no end in sight to the types of litigation that may
Driving
ensue.
home after her IVF, right?
Right. Even outside of the IVF laboratory.
Yeah. I think that's definitely a concern. I mean, we've seen that. And then ectopic pregnancies is another issue. If you're a physician treating an ectopic pregnancy, that embryo is never going to survive. Obviously, they're never going to develop into a human being. But if a person is a person at the time of fertilization, what does that even mean?
Right. I mean, that's an extra uterine child.
Yeah.
It's very scary.
I wanted to circle back
Very
on
scary.
Dr. Hirshfeld-Cytron's point about, you made the comment in passing, but I really think it's so important, which is, many of the people making these decisions have like a middle school or high school level understanding of biology. And so I wanted to take a minute to really commend all of the participants who are here today, whether you already, have all the facts or you're here to learn more about educating yourself, I think education is so incredibly important. And I think one thing that did come up when it's at the State of the Union is, I think, especially in the context of COVID, we've had some really unfortunate things happen, which is we've had this disenchantment with science as a society. And, for motivations that are not pure, I think people really have been convinced in some, sectors of, America that medicine is not to be believed, that science is not to be believed. And so we're coming into this conversation or continuing this conversation about reproductive rights, about abortion, and about IVF with people who have so little knowledge and don't care to learn what the truth is. And I think one great example of that was when Senator Tommy Tuberville was being, interviewed again, I think the day after the LePage ruling came out. And I mean, made absolutely no sense. And it was clear he didn't really even understand what IVF was. And this was somebody who at the federal level was in part responsible for making decisions about this. So education is critical. And I think I really commend this particular event and, other events. We really need to pay attention and educate your friends, educate your colleagues, anybody who's having questions. This is an opportunity to say, like, listen, this is what is conception. This is what an embryo is. This is what IVF is. And this is what we need to build our families, period.
Yeah. And I think every IVF patient will tell you that an embryo is not a child. Sadly, like we learn from firsthand understanding.
We do have one question. I know we getting towards the wrap up piece. Somebody had asked us if someone has one more embryo for their surrogacy journey that they hope to begin soon, but they haven't decided what they would do with the quote unquote leftover embryos. Do you think doctors will recommend making these decisions sooner rather than later, given the possibility of embryos being deemed people? So that was one of the questions posed to all of us, which I think as of now, the answer is, depends on theoretically where your embryos are. But I think it is scary to think that federal laws could come into play that would supersede anything we're able to do at a local level.
Right. And I think that at least in the short term, regardless of what happens in November, there probably aren't the numbers to pass that kind of federal law, but it doesn't mean that it won't happen. And I've been involved in Illinois legislation for decades now. And I very recently remember a legislator saying, like, yes, we're a great state right now, but we're always one election, from not protecting the rights of the people that need to be protected. So it's important to keep that in mind. I think it depends on where your embryos are. And I certainly, have been in touch with people I always tell people, just make a plan. If it seems like things are getting problematic in your state, know where they're going and how they're getting there. And that goes for clinics. I've talked to clinics in other states, surrounding states that have cryo tanks, in very problematic states. And they're trying to make decisions about, do we keep our lab there or do we move it somewhere across a border so that they're in a safer place? I think these are all really weighty questions.
Yeah. There was another question about if the Alabama ruling is challenged or revisited by a higher court, but I think you addressed that, Nidhi, that right now that's being
right. So I
think reheard.
The question might be, would it be appealed to the Supreme Court? All of these, all the questions that were addressed were state law questions. So it is, and the separation of church and state issues, all of that language was in a concurrence. It wasn't part of the findings. So that wouldn't be a basis upon which to appeal to the Supreme Court if one would, but I think the wisdom is probably not a great idea to do that anyway. But most legal scholars agree that there's really no federal issue at play here. They're all state law issues. So chances of having sort of an appealable issue are pretty low.
And can you speak a little bit about legislation that was enacted in Alabama and where that legislation falls a little bit short?
Sure. I think that the most important thing to remember about any sort of legislation that's going to protect IVF is if it protects IVF by saying that doctors can do their job and perform IVF and they're not going to have any sort of criminal or civil liability, but they don't address the issue of the embryos, and they don't give patients autonomy over how their embryos are used, and eventually when they're done with them, what decision-making occurs, then the legislation is not adequate. And so in Alabama, the legislation does not address the embryos and what sort of decision-making capabilities that the patients who created those embryos have. And so that's, there are kind of next stage, the people on the ground are saying like, our next stage is to either A, try to pass more legislation, or B, a constitutional amendment, probably both of which might be necessary. But without that, they're not going to get where they need to go in this. We're still going to have this ruling standing that says that embryos are people.
Well, I mean, our time is almost up. So this is such an incredibly important topic that obviously, although we'd love to, is not going to necessarily be solved tonight. Thank you so much to Nidhi for your incredible insights. They're so extraordinarily valuable. And thank you to Dr. Adeleye and Dr. Feinberg for being a part of this. We are so excited for Chicago Coalition of Family Building to not only provide webinars to talk about really timely topics, but to also address our other access issue besides political access, which is financial access to IVF services. And every April over Infertility Awareness Week, our grant applications go live. And so please look at our website, Chicago Coalition for Family Building, and follow us on social media so that you can see right away when those go live. And if this could help you or someone you know, please apply. So thank you to all